there's no one who knows more about how to work with those countries than our next guest. And again, Andy, thank you for joining us today from the United Nations. You're on mute. And just a brief introduction, again, Andy is the Chief for Medical Supply Logistics with the United Nations. He's a UK national, also Australian national. He's with Australian military service, and he's been assigned to the UN to help with medical support logistics and supply chain issues. And again, Andy, thank you for joining us. If you could share with our audience globally, remember, a lot of folks that don't have a lot of experience with some of the lowest resourced 1 billion people, what are some of the issues that we're facing in digital health and human rights as we're trying to really initiate and carry forward and progress a conversation around how to ensure that we're helping all 8 billion people on the planet, not just the wealthiest 1 billion.
Okay, so you can hear me, Stan, now?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, my apologies about not having my microphone on. Look, Stan, I obviously come from this from a slightly unique view, which is the military world, but also United Nations peacekeeping. And certainly, we are often dealing in very austere environments with using peacekeepers or providing care to population where the sort of resources are very limited. So one of the things that we are really interested in the UN and perhaps also within the broader military sphere is to try and bring what I would perhaps call the broader intellect of the medical community to the point of care, and how can we actually go about doing that. And so for us, there is a whole sort of thing in e-health where, whether it be from simple telemedicine through to artificial intelligence that we really need to exploit in the coming years. And within our organization, the United Nations, there is a sort of lack of equity across the organization in terms of what it is we can deliver. And that's one of the sort of things that we are addressing in the coming years. And to give you a simple example of that, in a typical peacekeeping mission, we will have three elements: a civilian element who provides sort of the political side of the mission. They will typically have the support side. And then on the ground, you will have military personnel and you will have police personnel. And then in addition to that, we then be supporting some element of the local community. For those people who work at the United Nations, we have an electronic health record, which actually allows us to track them from, leaving their home country into the mission area, looking at the healthcare that we are providing for them, and actually sort of look at in terms of what the long-term implications for their deployment has been. The same would be true of the small number of developed nations who provide sort of peacekeeping troops into these areas. But the majority of our peacekeepers come from developing nations. In fact, there's only one developed nation really in the top 20 of providers of peacekeepers. And so what we then see is this sort of slight lack of equity in terms of the health support that is provided to the peacekeepers on the ground, and our ability to perhaps track over the longer term what the health effects of that deployment were. So in the UN, we are trying to address that by working with those countries that provide the peacekeepers to try and put in place the kind of electronic medical record and the sort of epidemiological data gathering technology that we would need to be able to look at what the health of that group is. And one of the areas that we're particularly interested in is actually exploiting increasingly sort of artificial intelligence to start looking at what is actually happening with the guys on the ground, the peacekeepers on the ground, and as I say, what happens with them over time. So that's really one of the main areas that we are looking going forward. Now, one of the areas that we want to expand that into beyond the peacekeepers and with some of the other UN agencies is actually trying to do some of that work then with those places where we are doing true humanitarian operations. So that will be our colleagues in UNICEF and the World Food Programme, because they look after large populations of displaced people. And again, being able to actually identify what their healthcare problems are, and again, sort of trying to marshal some degree of clinical effect at the point of care is something we would like to be able to do. And if I can sort of perhaps give when I talk about marshalling clinical effect, and I will talk again, I'll come from a sort of military peacekeeper role, but it's equally applicable to, I think, anybody else working in an austere environment. The experience that we've had in the last 20 years or so, those countries who deployed to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, was that the sizes of the clinical teams we needed to deliver the kind of modern trauma care that's needed for polytrauma patients were very large. And so, you needed a whole range of specialists beyond the traditional general trauma surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, and anaesthetist. You needed burn specialists, neurosurgery, you need ophthalmologists, etc. But whilst we realise there's a need for much larger teams on one side, we're always under pressure to keep the number of boots on the ground as small as possible. So the conundrum then comes is, how do you bring the intellect of the complete clinical team into an operating theatre or a resuscitation room where you've only got a small number of people? And that covers, again, as I say, a whole range of things. So we're exploring anything from, the tradition of what we're doing now, just being able to speak back to a specialist and have this conversation, but actually through to virtual reality. So the full mask, haptics, so that, say, an inexperienced general surgeon might be directed by a much more experienced vascular surgeon on how to do a particular piece of surgery, or at least do a pre-operative rehearsal of the surgery they're going to do. So they can, you can take the medical imaging that has been done, the sort of CT, the MRI, whatever else you have, you bring that together, and then you artificially create the injury, and then maybe the less experienced surgeon on the ground can rehearse the surgery they're going to do with the more experienced person over their shoulder saying, hey, don't do that, do this. So, that kind of thing that we want to introduce. Now, obviously, for a Western military like Australia, where I'm from, we have the money potentially to do that. But the question is how in the coming years are we going to push that down and actually make it much more available, both internationally, so somebody in one country can assist, say, somebody in a developing country, or within a developing country, how can somebody in, say, a national capital where those facilities exist provide that assistance to more sort of regionally based and local hospitals? So I think there's a whole sort of series of technologies which are emerging, which we in the military world, the peacekeeping world, the humanitarian world, and then into what I would call the developing world, this sort of cascading down. And I think, there is an opportunity there to address some of the inequities there are in healthcare around the world.
Yeah, that is extraordinary to see as well, and just how it is important to work toward these efforts, because as you mentioned earlier, the greater the healthcare stability within these countries, free market democracies and others, the greater the stability of the country itself. And we're seeing that today work itself out. So again, really appreciate your time today, Andy. Thank you very much for joining and really sharing your perspective and everything that you've learned with so many people, not only who are tuning into the program today right now, but are going to be looking at it around the world on the HitLab YouTube channel afterwards. Thank you very much. Tremendous lessons learned from Andy Williams from the United Nations, again, heading up their logistics and supply chain efforts, which you can argue it's never been more important to do so than today. And the fact that he is there in New York City, in the UN General Assembly headquarters, is just amazing. And it's important work that he's doing.